Okay, welcome 111. This is a lesson on rhetorical appeals and enthymemes in visual arguments, which you will be able to use and apply to the homework you're doing for the second half of this week, week 4. So let's get started. I want in this video to introduce to you a concept that you already are implicitly aware of, but I'm going to make that explicit for you because it's going to help you in analyzing both written texts and visual texts. All right, so let's begin by looking at what is called the rhetorical triangle. The rhetorical triangle was described by Aristotle, who was thinking about how people persuade each other. What is it that we do what is it that we say, and how do we say it that makes people actually change their minds? All right, this is the science of, or the study of rhetoric, and the word rhetoric simply means persuasion, the art of persuasion. Every act of rhetoric, every attempt to persuade somebody, is always implying at least a three-part structure. Somebody, that's the author, is saying something, that's the audience, that's the message to an audience for a specific purpose. Now, what this part in here means, this is the message, or you can just replace the word message with text. This is the text inside the triangle. The act of the text, the act of the message, implies these three parts: the author, the audience, the purpose. Now, what does this tell us? This tells us that in any rhetorical act, any time somebody says something or shows something to somebody, you can analyze it by starting by identifying what these three parts of the triangle are. Who is saying what to whom, and why are they saying it? And that why question is perhaps the most important. What is the purpose behind the act of speaking or writing or creating a visual? What is the purpose behind that? Is it a teacher trying to teach something to a student? Is it a corporation trying to sell something to an audience? Is it a politician trying to persuade an audience to vote for him or her? Right? If you know the rhetorical situation, if you understand what's going on in the triangle, you can more easily identify the purpose. And once you can identify the purpose, you'll be able to see the ways in which a text is put together to try to arrive at that purpose. Okay, and we'll do lots of examples of that in a minute. And there's another part about rhetoric that you need to think about, and that is it's a different triangle. There's two different triangles here. They're different triangles. They're separate, but they're both very important to understand how rhetorical persuasion works. The first triangle was what happens in any rhetorical act: author, audience, purpose. The second triangle is the three ways that persuasion happens in the message. Aristotle calls these the three appeals, or the three modes of persuasion. And they are logos, pathos, and ethos. These are the Greek words for these three modes of persuasion. All right, what are these three modes of persuasion? Logos, we'll start with that one. That one's super easy. You know this. This is logic. All right, this is what we've been doing this week and last week. This is about syllogisms, deductive, inductive reasoning, offering evidence, putting your argument in an order that makes sense. These are the rules that Weston has been talking to us about. How do you logically construct an argument to be persuasive? That's logos. The logical appeal of an argument tells us why something rationally makes sense to do it or to believe it. Now, Aristotle posited that just simple logic is not enough to persuade people. This is an interesting thing about human nature to think about. It's not enough to just say, if A, X, then Y, X, therefore Y. People aren't quite persuaded simply by cold, hard reasoning. And Aristotle reasons that this is because as human beings, we are emotional. We have what he calls the irascible parts of our souls, which means that we are not just brains, we actually are bodies as well, and we have feelings and emotions in the connection between our bodies and brains. And so we need something more to persuade us besides logic, and that is pathos, or the emotional appeal. Pathos just means emotions. So the pathetic appeal, or pathos, is the part of rhetoric that looks at how messages or texts are constructed to create specific emotional effects in the viewers or the audience or the reader, how those words or visuals create emotional effects, and why those emotional effects help to persuade. Yeah, Aristotle says you can hear a very cold logical argument but not be moved to action. And so emotions move us. They're intrinsically a kind of moving feeling inside of us, or an expression, or an awareness of something that wants us to act. If you feel happy or sad or disgusted or proud, and you have reasons for it, you're more likely to do a thing like vote or learn or buy a product or whatever your intentional action is. If you feel emotionally driven, you're more likely to do it. So those are two very important parts, rhetoric. But there's actually a third part, perhaps a secret weapon, a less appreciated part that people think about less often, or I should say, is more subtly or more implicit in messages. It's a little more invisible, and that's is ethos, or the ethical appeal. The adjectival form of that is ethical appeal for ethos. This Greek word means the moral credibility or believability of a speaker. I like the word credibility because it suggests the idea that an audience member believes in the legitimacy of a speaker. And more importantly, the way I like to think about it is, this is about trying to get the audience to make sure that they think the speaker has their best interests in mind. Why should I believe you, politician? Why should I believe you, commercial or teacher? Do you have my best interests in mind? Do you share my values? And if I don't believe, as a listener or an audience member, if I don't believe that you share my values, if you're the speaker talking to me, or the commercial advertising to me, if I don't believe you share my values, I'm much less likely to be persuaded and to be moved to action and buy the product or vote. Even if your logic is great, even if you've pricked some emotions in me, if there's red flags going on with credibility, you don't seem trustworthy. That's another great way to think about it, that you're trustworthy. If you don't seem trustworthy, I'm not likely going to ultimately be persuaded. I'm going to hold back. So Aristotle says an excellent rhetorical texts, things that persuade very effectively, are doing all three of these very well. All three are working. All three are successful. They're all happening in a text at any time. You can look at a text for its logical structure. You can look at a text for its emotional argument. And you can look at a text for how it tries to establish credibility. They're all in there. And so you have to, in a rhetorical analysis, you have to look at a text to ask, how well is a text doing on these appeals? And if there are major flaws in any area, you can bet that audiences will be less likely to be persuaded. And there are some very basic, about 5 or 6 really basic emotions that all persuasive, pathetic appeals really use, because human beings are pretty simple. There's only so many emotions we really are moved to action by, and they're here: sympathy or pity for another person, fear, anger, very powerful emotions. A sense of belonging, like being part of a tribe, right? So a lot of parts of our political situation right now in the United States are driven by this emotion. What race or political affiliation do I belong to? And there's a lot of tension about senses of belonging. And then pride or vanity. I want to look or feel like I'm valued or good. Very powerful emotions. So these are about the 5 different emotional options you have when you're persuading somebody. And I should also mention that you shouldn't, if you're thinking about creating a text, you shouldn't overdo it on the pathos, right? If people notice that you're trying to appeal to their emotions, they get skeptical. So this has to be done subtly, through suggestion, through subtle word choices, and we'll look at how that looks in a second. Okay, what are some things, how do you establish good ethos? Really good question, right? What do you do? Maybe let's say you're just a college student and you have to give a presentation. You're not a well-known person. How do your reputation doesn't precede you, good or bad? How do you create good ethos? Well, these are some of the ways you do that. You have to show your audience that you have their best interest in mind, and that's called ingratiating yourself to your audience. And you ingratiate yourself to your audience by showing that you share their same values. You share their same values. Now that's kind of a complicated thing. How do you strategically do that? I'll try to show you some where it's happening, and when you start to see it, I think it becomes more apparent when you're analyzing texts. You can establish credibility in your you can create a reputation for yourself in the text by showing in some way that you are well trained to talk about this topic, or that you have experience. Maybe you have life experience. Let's talk about maybe good canoes. You want to sell a good canoe to somebody. Well, maybe you're trained in good canoes, or maybe you have experience with years of using different types of canoes. And so sometimes you do have a credibility that comes from your credentials, and you can appeal to that. You can just say that, or you can imply that in your message. I have this experience. That's why you should trust me. I know what I'm talking about. You can establish good ethos through modesty. People want to see, are you a good person? Do you seem to have balanced moral judgment? And part of showing that you have balanced moral judgment and therefore are trustworthy as a person is showing that you are a modest person. And part of showing you're a modest person is that you only say what you can actually support. You don't go further. You don't overblow things. You don't amplify things or become hyperbolic or go overboard. You stay with what is what you can actually support, what you can back up, putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak. That modesty goes a long way with people. Another thing that goes a long way with people is showing that you as a human being are aware that the world is complicated, that people are complicated, that there aren't easy answers to things, and showing in some way a tolerance for ambiguity and complexity in difficult issues especially is a great way to establish credibility. Another way to establish credibility is to show that you are a professional person. You either look good or your presentation looks good. And so that shows that you're serious, that you have care about what you do. I like to tell students this is why it matters that your papers look correctly formatted and well edited when you submit them, because it establishes credibility with your audience. It might just be your professor or your future employer, your future supervisor who you're applying for a job to, but that professional looking document establishes credibility. It's really an ethical appeal. You're trying to persuade them to give you a good grade or a job. And then finally, what this really all amounts to is that you're a trustworthy, sensible human being, and that makes people feel safe, right? You're not some kind of automaton robot or superhuman person who has no flaws or at least no human desires. You're a human being in some way and because again, you're trying to show that you share the values of your audience. I'm going to start with an example or two of these 3 appeals working in written texts, and then we're going to look at visual text, images. So here is a regular text, very simple argument. Let's look how it's put together. Will has written a very traditional op-ed piece that states its purpose very clearly in the first paragraph. Right up front, it's not hiding anything. Here it is explicitly. In actually right here, the second sentence, adding 10 feet, pitchers and hitters would have more time to avoid being hit. He wants there to be a change in baseball, right? We can discern that purpose. And now once we've done that, mostly what we're trying to do is discern the purpose by looking at the rhetorical triangle. And that's pretty easy here. Now we move on to the second step, which is the three appeals. How does the author, Dvorak, appeal to logic, emotions, and the ethical appeal or credibility? How does he do that? And we can analyze that even in just this small piece. We can just look at a few choices that he makes. Let's start with the first thing, logic. Where does he have logic in his argument? Well, one thing you can see here is he gets into some nitty-gritty factual things about the history of baseball. The bases were created, the distance between bases and mound were created when the ball was being thrown very much slower. Right? So just using, and the numbers show the argument here. The baseball is now being pitched 20 to almost 40 times, 40% faster than it was. And therefore, we should increase the distance between the home plate and the mound. Or another way you could write it is, what's the hidden assumption in here? Well, the hidden assumption or the major premise in the syllogism is, it is not good to have lots of injuries in baseball or to subject baseball players to danger, right? So let's mitigate or minimize the danger, and this is one way we can do it. So baseball has gotten dangerous. Here's a practical solution. Boom. That's in a nutshell, this is like the logical structure of this argument. But what about these two new appeals that I've introduced to you this afternoon? The emotional appeal and the ethical appeal. Well, let's start with emotions. Where in this small text do you see potentially words or phrases that might create an emotional response in the reader? It could be something that's said just to incite our emotions or feelings, or it could be something that's implied. Now, I would start as Will does. This is a very common writer move, is to start with what's called a hook sentence. And when writers talking about technique talk about the hook sentence, what they're really talking about is an immediate vivid emotional connection to some issue or idea. All right. So look at the word choice here and see how it might create some emotions. Every year, too many baseball players, both hitters and pitchers, have their faces crushed, eye sockets fractured, and brains concussed because the pitcher's mound is too close to the batter's box. Now, if you're thinking that the harsh terms in here, or there's some harsh word choices, crushed, faces crushed, that's a very visceral phrase. Eye sockets fractured. When you hear that phrase, you can imagine or almost feel in your face, if you're a very sensitive person, you can almost feel your eye sockets kind of twinge a little bit in your brain subconsciously because of the idea that the sense-based word choices here. Crushed, eye sockets fractured, brains concussed. These are visceral words, graphic almost in their choice. So when you choose words that are more sense-based and perhaps graphic or directly incite a kind of response, you might be thinking that's where there's an emotional appeal happening, right? So this is a statement of fact. Every year, too many. This happens to too many people, but it's more than just the logic here. This is also an emotional response. After you read this, Will wants you to feel like this is a very bad thing. He doesn't say that this is bad, but that's clearly what he means, because these concepts, crushed faces and eye sockets fractured, we all know as general human beings, this is bad. What feeling are we feeling? I would say we're feeling sympathy or pity for the baseball players. We don't want them to be subjected to needless suffering, right? That's a human emotion, and that's easily incited by saying something like this. All right, so there's already something important to notice here. Logic and logic and emotion and ethical appeals, they all happen overlapping at the same time in texts. It's not like this is only logic in here and this is only emotions in here. Sometimes they happen kind of by themselves, but most of the time they're always overlapping. This is a logical statement. Too many people are getting hurt. But this is also an emotional statement. Here's another emotional appeal. What about our young players coming up in high school and college who endure the risk of a life-threatening smack? Another word choice, life-threatening. Another word choice that are created to make our emotions feel a little more agitated, to feel a little more incited or motivated. That's pretty serious. He could have written it with less graphic words, right? And interestingly, when we know as human beings that we feel pity, especially for the young, for children, for babies. This is a very basic human nature response. Instinctually, we want to protect our children. So by appealing to the threat to young players in particular, right? They're not super young, high school and college, but they are legitimately in danger of this problem, and they're younger than full-blown adults. Most readers are going to feel emotionally compelled by that. Okay? So that's the emotional appeal. Now, what about the ethical appeal, credibility? That we think that where in here do we maybe feel that Will Dvorak is or isn't trustworthy? This one is, again, this is the most invisible or subtle one, because people don't come out very often and say, you must trust me on this because of something I've done or because of my beliefs. But the way to look for this is, where does Will share our values? Well, again, in an overlapping kind of way, this is emotional because of the words used and the people he's talking about. But he also is showing us that he values protection of the young. He values protecting everybody from needless suffering, but he also shows us that he's especially thinking about the most vulnerable and least most physically fragile people group, the younger people. So he shares our values. We as human beings want to protect other people. We don't want other people to suffer needlessly. If he didn't care about that, then he would be untrustworthy. But in fact, he seems to care about that. So that resonates with our human nature. He seems like a sensible person. He only wants to do what is sensible. He's not making any outlandish value judgments here. He just wants to be a decent human being, right? So that's a large part of the ethical appeal. There's another ethical appeal, maybe in this middle paragraph. This one's a little more advanced. Can you guess what I might be thinking about? Where in this paragraph does he show us that he is a credible, trustworthy writer, and he strengthens his ethical appeal? Well, let me just say what I'm thinking. He knows something about the history of baseball. And to understand, have knowledge, it's not necessarily deep research, but he understands basic facts about history. And that is good. If he was uninformed about the basic facts of the subject, then that would be an immediate red flag. But he knows his history, even as basic as it is here. It's not super scientific, but the basic knowledge helps to show he knows what he's talking about, right? So, so all these three things work together, and he's doing so in a very basic piece of writing. So let's talk now about visual images and how those texts, visual texts, image-based texts, use these three appeals to persuade us, and ultimately how they use enthymemes, which is again, that logical syllogism that's missing one or more premises. Okay. This is a famous painting by Delacroix, a lady called Lady Liberty, and it took place at the time of the French Revolution. And I'm not going to go into depth here, but I just want to show you how images on their own act in the same way that written texts act on viewers or audience members. You can think about Delacroix's painting as an act of rhetoric. What does he want us to believe or feel when we view this painting? What is he arguing? Now, you have to know a couple of things about the painting. One is that this is an important battle that had been taking place during the French Revolution, and that this woman is a allegorical figure called Lady Liberty. So she represents liberty, and with that, and this is the French flag, and with that, you can start to see what's going on here. This is the lower class trying to fight for. They are the side of the revolution to overthrow the political power that's been oppressing them. Here are some victims of that revolutionary army who had been slain in battle. Here's a young child who's charging into the battle, and many other people who are charging forward to continue the battle over the bodies of the fallen, right? And who's leading them? Lady Liberty. So Delacroix is making a very simple argument here. Keep fighting, young revolutionary fighters. Keep the cause alive. You will eventually be victorious. Now, where am I getting that last part from? You'll eventually be victorious. Well, Lady Liberty is a kind of maternal mother figure, and she comes from Greek. She's like a Greek mythological deity, and so that symbolism suggests that there's a kind of divine support or providence to the war. That those who are fighting on the side of revolution and enlightenment will eventually win because in the divine nature of things, they are on the right side of history, on the right side of the cause. So the divinity symbolized by Lady Liberty is partly the suggestion, not stated explicitly, you will win, but it's suggested that you will win, and your cause is noble. Okay, here's an advertisement by the U.S. Department of Transportation against drunk driving, or actually buzzed driving, and you can see in a matter of seconds how this advertisement is supposed to work on you to persuade you not to drive buzzed. Okay, and so you have to know, of course, that buzz driving is a kind of a term that people use to say I've only had one or two drinks, I'm not drunk, because drunk has a certain legal and cultural understanding of being fully intoxicated and really slurred speech and all these things. So buzzed is considered like a milder form of drunkenness, and very frequently people claim they can drive buzzed, right? So that's the rhetorical situation. The audience is people who say those things. The author is the U.S. Department of Transportation, and their purpose is to convince you not to drive buzzed. Now, what is the argument that they're making? Well, it seems so obvious that it's almost a waste of time to spell it out. But let's spell it out, because that's what you're going to be doing when you analyze visual arguments. What is the logical argument here, and how is it made? You can pause the video to think about how you would answer that question. But I'll say it now, after you've thought about it. All right, so the logical argument is something like this. This man was drunk driving, and he was in an accident, and these horrible injuries happened to him. But this man was only buzz driving, and yet the same consequences happened. So different causes, drunk driving versus buzz driving, but similar consequences. Car accident with injuries, car accident with injuries, right? So ostensibly, judging from the results, these two are equivalent. Drunk driving and buzz driving are equivalent because they result in the same negative consequences. And so, as a final statement of that argument, They just create that equivalency. Buzz driving is drunk driving, right? If you're thinking about safety on the roads, they are no different because the same thing happens, right? So the similarity of images is actually just a complete copy and paste of the same image. It's just an outright same image. But the similarity of these two images and the labels make that argument. Okay? Now, are there any emotional appeals? Yeah, we have sympathy for this guy. He looks like he's in pain. He looks sad. His facial expression even suggests a sense of regret and self-pity. And we feel sad for him because he's suffering. So showing us that pain, showing us those injuries, suggests the pain. We feel that emotional appeal. And then the ethical appeal. Why might we feel that the U.S. Department of Transportation has our best interest in mind, is trustworthy? Well, very easy. They are just trying to help us not kill ourselves and not injure ourselves. They have our best interest in mind because they're trying to save us from unnecessary suffering by making good choices. So the human value element behind this is very clear. They have a good cause, so we can trust them. Or at least we should be more inclined to trust them. Let's maybe look at this one. So this is an advertisement for Dove soap. And you can look at this and immediately ask yourself, well, what is the rhetorical triangle? Who is trying to persuade whom to do what? And with advertising, it's very easy. We know that the purpose is that they want somebody to buy their product. And we know who is that somebody? It's the corporation or business behind the product. So Dove is the speaker. The purpose is to buy the product. And who is the audience? Well, I would have to imagine it would not likely be primarily, at least, guys, right? Or anybody who doesn't identify with this term girls, we girls, or this model, the image of this model. If you don't feel, I don't feel personally like I would identify with this phrase, we girls, or this the way this model is looking. So this is probably an advertisement, in other words, for a specific set of viewers, women viewers, anybody who might feel like this appeals to them, right? So they're going for a specific audience, and how are they making that argument? What is the logic of this advertisement? Advertisements usually don't make their logic as clear as in other forms of texts. Maybe we'll come back to the logic. What is the emotional appeal of this? The emotional appeal comes obviously partly through the way that this model looks. She looks like she's very relaxed and experiencing joy or happiness, right? Another way is other visual cues, like look at how fun the way the typography is here, the way the font is laid out. The font choice is very relaxing and I don't know, trendy or contemporary. And the way it's arranged with the blocked color. The color itself is the color look of cucumbers, right? Green. So the green color suggests a tone of coolness, since cucumbers suggest coolness. And look, cucumbers are in the product. The cucumber is on the product box. So this is called metaphoric or visual transfer. When we can see that the colors and the ingredients all are sort of transferred to the product. And so why is this shampoo going to make us feel cool and less freaked out? Well, it's because it's putting ingredients that create a sense of coolness and relaxation in the product itself, right? So this is the result we want or we desire, or the female audience desires. They want to feel cool and relaxed. How are they going to get it? Because the ingredients for coolness, like cucumbers, are in this product. All right, so that's something like the logical argument. I always went back and did the logical argument analysis there. Sorry. The emotional appeal is you feel compelled to be like this woman. You want to feel relaxed. And then the ethical appeal. Now here's something I noticed is, look at the way it's worded. It's time we girls cooled off more and freaked out less. Well, yeah, being cool and less freaked out is good, but why do they say it that way? It's time we girls cooled off more and freaked out less. Well, what are they talking about freaking out? What is this idea that there's these freaked out girls? Who are these freaked out girls, right? Um, if you know anything about popular contemporary American culture, you can discern quickly that there's a kind of hyper adrenaline pressure of being a certain kind of woman at a certain age in a certain place in our culture. The concept of the basic girl comes to mind, maybe. I don't mean to be pejorative, but they're talking about a very mainstream kind of experience of being a young woman in America, right? And that experience, they'd like you to think, is actually highly stressful, and that you deserve to not feel that stress sometimes. You deserve to have a cooled off feeling. So the ethical appeal here is something like, we understand you, young women of America in 2018, or 10, or whenever this advertisement was run. We understand life is tough. We understand you feel stressed, and we connect with that value, with that experience. So their value system is to give more relaxation and less stress to people. And that seems like a good value. And so combined, the ingredients argument, the way you want to feel argument, it all appeals to make you feel like you want to buy this product. All right, so I've just used the rhetorical triangle once again. I've used the rhetorical triangle and the three appeals to analyze this advertisement. I'm going to ask you to analyze a few visual arguments that are on a website that's linked in the week's unit, and to write out in standard form what that argument logically might be saying. And you're going to have to construct those statements on your own based on how you're interpreting the image. So let's look at one, all right? So the place I'm sending you, the website I'm sending you, this is their first example. And they came up with something like this. Okay, so you can look at the image first of all, and you can see for yourself what it's trying to make you feel or do, right? What's the purpose? To get men to join the submarine service, right? So here's a good trick. Always start with the purpose. What is the purpose? That's the first thing to determine. They want men to join the submarine service, so we can put that as the conclusion. Then we have to figure out what is the major claim or premise, logical premise for why we should do that. Well, looking at this advertisement, you see the prominent subject matter or theme is that there's this man and woman embracing. They look very happy. This is a good embrace, not a bad embrace. They look perhaps in love. And then there's subtle clues that she's not just only in love with him, but that she admires him. Namely, she's touching his badge here, which is obviously symbolic for his rank or his participation in the Navy, the Army, the naval forces. So something about him being the status of a submarine serviceman is admirable to her, right? He's in his uniform. Obviously, he's clearly identified, right? She's not identified in anything other than being a beautiful woman, but that's all they need. They just want you to feel that you should be a serviceman because you want to be admired by women, all right? So you see I've written it out in standard form here. Women admire men who are who volunteer for the submarine service. Here's the words that explain exactly what's going on, right? He volunteered. And so if this is true, how do you get from this major premise, the value or the main suggestion of the image, how do you get from that to the conclusion? Well, the minor premise, I had to fill in myself, so I wrote it out like this. You, presumably a man, right? This wouldn't work for a woman. They want men to join the service, in this advertisement at least. You want to be admired by women. Now that's an assumption, right? Nobody is forcing me to agree with that. Maybe I'm already married. Maybe I'm just going to be a celibate man, or maybe I'm not attracted to women. It's assuming this, right? And if that doesn't appeal to me, then this argument is not going to work, right? But it's pretty safe to say that many men will agree with this. And so this argument ends up being a pretty clear and straightforward one that works probably much of the time, right? So this is what you're doing for your homework. You're going to look at several images and fill in the logical argument. Okay, that is the end of my lesson on visual arguments and using the rhetorical appeals of logos, pathos, and ethos. So I'm going to sign off here. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll be seeing you in week 5.